She was 29 years old when the town of Ash Hollow turned its back on her, and by the time the winter wind finished carving through the valley, she had exactly $3, 2 cracked coins worth 50 cents each, and a thin strip of paper money folded so many times it had softened like cloth. It was the year 1897 along the frozen edge of the North Platte River, where the land itself seemed to forget warmth. The man who cast her out was not a stranger but Judge Harlan Pierce, the same man who once praised her father's honesty before condemning her family's name to ruin after the failed grain contracts collapsed and the mill debt swallowed everything they owned. He called it justice. The town called it necessity. With those last coins, she did something no sensible woman in Ash Hollow would ever have done. She walked through the snow to the river's edge and bought the abandoned Icehouse for $3 from a railway clerk who laughed as he handed over the rusted key. The structure was half collapsed, swallowed by frost and neglect, its timber ribs bowed like the bones of a dying animal. Locals said it was cursed, that men who stored ice there heard knocking beneath the frozen floor even in summer. They said the river kept secrets under its skin, and the Icehouse was where those secrets froze solid. And yet she bought it. Because beneath its frozen floor, sealed under years of ice and silence, something was waiting. Something the old survey maps had hinted at but never explained. Something heavy enough to change not just her life, but the fate of the entire river settlement if it were ever brought into the light again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Mercer. If you're listening from a place that feels forgotten, from a stretch of life where even the walls seem to have given up on you, tell us in the comments where the cold has found you too. Eliza Mercer had not always been a woman of ruins and frostbitten bargains. There had been a time when her life carried the soft rhythm of certainty, back when her father, Thomas Mercer, ran the River Ledger office in Ash Hollow and every shipment that passed through the valley was recorded in ink so precise it seemed to resist error itself. She grew up in a narrow wooden house that leaned slightly toward the river, as though always listening. Her earliest memories were of ink-stained fingers and the sound of quills scratching across paper like distant rain. Her mother, Ruth Mercer, had been a schoolteacher before illness took her strength, and it was from her that Eliza learned the quiet discipline of reading what others overlooked. Ruth believed that truth was often buried in margins, in footnotes, in the spaces between what men said and what they meant. Eliza carried that belief like a lantern through her childhood. While other girls in Ash Hollow learned embroidery and etiquette, she learned account balancing, ledger correction, and the subtle language of discrepancies. By the age of 16, she could detect a falsified shipment record by the faintest imbalance in grain weight calculations. Her father once joked that she could hear dishonesty the way others heard church bells. But there was pride in his voice then, and hope that the world would always have a place for someone who cared so deeply about correctness. Ash Hollow itself was a river town stretched thin along the North Platte, a place where the railroad had arrived like a sharp promise and never fully delivered on its shine. It was a settlement of wind-scoured streets, timber storefronts, and men who measured their worth in cargo hauled and cattle driven. Yet beneath its roughness, it depended on people like the Mercers. Without accurate ledgers, without trust in numbers, the entire river trade would collapse into rumor and theft. Eliza grew up believing that precision was a kind of morality. To record truth faithfully was to serve the world itself. That belief would later become both her strength and her undoing. The first fracture came slowly, like ice forming beneath deep water. Her father's ledger office began receiving shipments tied to a new grain syndicate operating upriver. The records did not match the cargo. At first, the discrepancies were small, easily dismissed as clerical errors. Then they widened into gaps too large to ignore. Thomas Mercer reported them, as he was obligated to do, and in doing so he signed his own professional death sentence. The syndicate was backed by men who preferred silence to scrutiny. Judge Harlan Pierce, who sat in quiet authority over Ash Hollow's legal affairs, ruled that Mercer's accusations were reckless, unverified, and damaging to the town's economic stability. Within weeks, contracts were revoked. Within months, debts that had once been manageable became crushing. Eliza remembers the night her father stopped speaking altogether. He sat at his desk long after the lamps were extinguished, staring at empty pages as though the ink might return on its own if he waited long enough. Her mother's cough filled the house like a metronome of decline. And then came the day the sheriff arrived. They did not use force. They did not need to. The foreclosure papers were enough. The ledger office was seized. The house was marked for auction. The Mercer name, once quietly respected, became a warning whispered in taverns: do not trust those who question too much. Eliza tried to fight it in the only way she knew how. She compiled evidence. She reconstructed shipment patterns. She traced falsified entries across months of records. But the deeper she dug, the more resistance she met, as though the town itself had agreed to forget what she was trying to prove. When her mother died that winter, the house became too large for grief. When her father disappeared 2 weeks later, some said east, some said into the river, Eliza was left with nothing but a single trunk of ledgers and the habits of careful observation that no one wanted anymore. She survived by taking temporary work copying shipping manifests at the railway depot, but even there her precision was unwelcome. Men who benefited from loose accounting did not appreciate someone who made the truth inconvenient. She was paid less each week until even that work vanished. By the time Ash Hollow fully closed its doors to her, she had already learned the first rule of ruin: it does not arrive all at once. It arrives in small, polite reductions of possibility until nothing remains but breath and memory. It was during those last hollow weeks that she began walking the riverbank. The North Platte in winter was not a river so much as a long sheet of broken glass, slow-moving and indifferent. Ice gathered along its edges in thick, uneven plates. And there, at the bend where the railroad bridge cast its shadow, she first saw the abandoned Icehouse. It had once been used to store river-cut ice for railway shipments in summer months, a vital link in the trade economy. But newer facilities upriver had rendered it obsolete. Now it stood half-sunk into the frozen bank, its roof sagging under accumulated snow, its doors swollen shut by decades of frost. Locals avoided it. Children were warned away. Even the railway clerk who eventually sold it to her crossed himself before handing over the key. And yet Eliza saw something others did not. Not usefulness exactly, but potential structure. The kind of thing that, if understood correctly, might still hold its original purpose beneath all the neglect layered over it. So she bought it. The day she unlocked the Icehouse, the wind was so sharp it felt like broken glass against her cheeks. The key turned with resistance, as though the building itself resisted being remembered. Inside, the air was colder than the river, dense with the smell of old timber and trapped winters. She brought only a lantern, a hammer, and the last of her strength. It was beneath the central floorboards that she first noticed the anomaly. The ice there was different, thicker, unnaturally uniform, as though poured rather than formed. When she struck it with the hammer, the sound that returned was not the hollow crack of ice but something deeper, denser. Metal beneath ice does not usually speak. But this did. A dull resonance echoed upward, slow and deliberate, like something answering from beneath sleep. And in that moment, Eliza Mercer understood that her $3 had not purchased ruin. It had purchased a question. The ice cracked again under her hammer, but this time it did not resist like frozen water, it yielded like a locked breath finally released after decades of holding still. Eliza Mercer lowered the lantern closer, her hands trembling not from fear but from the strange certainty forming in her chest, the same instinct she had once used to detect falsified ledgers now whispering that something beneath this ice did not belong to nature alone. The glow revealed seams in the frozen floor, not random fractures but deliberate lines, as though someone had once sealed a compartment beneath the Icehouse and intended it never to be opened again. She pressed her palm against the surface, feeling a faint vibration that was impossible in something dead and frozen, and when she struck again, a hollow metallic echo rolled upward like a response from a buried throat. For a long moment she simply stood there, listening to the silence answer her. Then she began clearing the ice with careful, measured strikes, each movement deliberate, each breath controlled, until at last a section gave way and revealed iron plating beneath, riveted and old, blackened by time but intact beneath the frost. It was not part of the Icehouse structure. It had been hidden inside it. The realization settled slowly, heavy and precise. Someone had built a sealed chamber under this forgotten building, and the river had kept it preserved like a secret refusing to die. Eliza wiped her glove across the metal and found markings, faint but unmistakable, numbers stamped in repeating sequences, like a ledger system, like inventory. Her heart tightened at the familiarity. This was not random storage. This was record-keeping, or something pretending to be it. She found a narrow seam along the edge and inserted her hammer's claw into it, applying pressure until a reluctant latch gave way with a sound like a sigh from deep underground. A thin rush of colder air escaped upward, carrying with it the faint smell of iron, old paper, and something sharper, like dust that had never known daylight. Beneath the panel was a cavity, and within that cavity sat a strongbox, reinforced with iron bands and sealed with a lock so intricate it belonged more to a bank vault than a river icehouse. Eliza did not open it immediately. She simply stared at it, understanding now that her $3 purchase had never been about shelter or survival. It had been about access. Somewhere beyond the ice and iron, someone had hidden something with intention, and the icehouse had been chosen not for convenience but for invisibility. When she finally lifted the box free, it was heavier than expected, as though the contents resisted being moved into the world above. She carried it to the lantern light and traced the lock mechanism with slow recognition, realizing with a tightening breath that it matched the same numbering system she had seen in the abandoned grain ledgers her father once warned her about before everything collapsed. Her father's voice seemed suddenly close again, not as memory but as warning, and for the first time since losing her family, Eliza felt that the river itself might still be speaking through forgotten structures like this one. And inside that locked box, she knew without opening it, was not merely wealth, but proof. Inside the lantern's trembling circle of light, Eliza Mercer finally worked the lock open, and the strongbox exhaled a sound that felt almost alive, as though it had been waiting longer than any human should have to wait for release. The lid resisted for a moment, then yielded with a slow, protesting groan, and what lay inside did not glitter immediately. As treasure often does in tales told carelessly around tavern tables. Instead, there were layers, carefully arranged leather-bound bundles, sealed envelopes stamped with unfamiliar insignias, and beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth that had aged into brittle darkness, were small velvet pouches that carried a weight too deliberate to be ordinary. When she opened the first pouch, a sharp glint of refracted lantern light scattered across the interior walls of the icehouse, and she understood at once that these were not simple gemstones but diamonds, uncut and carefully sorted, each one labeled in ink that matched the same numbering system she had seen carved into the iron chamber itself. Her breath caught not from greed but from recognition, because she had seen such systems before, in ledgers, in shipping manifests, in records that were meant to hide as much as they revealed. As she unfolded the leather bundles, the truth began to assemble itself in fragments, clandestine rail shipments rerouted through Ash Hollow, falsified grain records used as cover, and signatures that traced directly back to offices of authority, including the unmistakable seal of Judge Harlan Pierce himself. But it was the final document, a brittle letter written in a hand strained by time, that changed everything, because it described the icehouse not as storage but as a dead-drop site for wealth extracted through systematic corruption along the river trade routes, a place chosen precisely because no one would ever think to look beneath frozen timber for law. Eliza stood very still as the lantern flickered, the ice beneath her boots seeming suddenly less like ground and more like memory, and she realized her father had not been dismissed for error at all but silenced for discovering exactly this hidden network. The diamonds were not merely wealth, they were evidence, physical proof of a long-running arrangement that had drained the river towns piece by piece while maintaining the illusion of lawful commerce. Outside, the wind pressed against the icehouse walls as if the past itself were trying to lean in closer, and Eliza understood that opening this box meant she could never return to the life of invisibility she had been forced into, because truth once uncovered does not allow itself to be buried again. She closed the strongbox slowly, not to hide it but to steady herself, and in that quiet moment the decision formed with absolute clarity: this discovery would not belong to her alone, and it would not be used to escape Ash Hollow, but to confront the machinery that had erased her family and kept the river in silent submission for years. And though she did not yet know how one woman with frozen breath and a ruined name could challenge men who controlled law, rail, and ledger alike, she now held something they could not ignore, something that had been hidden so carefully beneath ice that it had forgotten it was ever meant to be found at all. Outside the icehouse, the wind had changed, as though the river itself had sensed the disturbance and was now pressing closer in slow, deliberate currents of air that crept under Eliza Mercer's coat and searched for weakness. She stood for a long time with the strongbox closed again at her feet, the weight of what she had seen settling into her like a second spine, heavier than exhaustion, sharper than grief, and far more dangerous than poverty had ever been. The diamonds inside were not simply wealth hidden away by corrupt hands, they were fragments of a system that had been quietly draining Ash Hollow and every settlement along the river for years. And the ledger marks she had recognized were proof that her father had not failed but had instead come too close to exposing the truth. In that realization, her memory shifted, and suddenly every silence that followed her father's dismissal felt intentional, every cold glance in town meetings felt coordinated, every refusal to listen felt like part of something larger than ignorance. She looked back at the frozen floor beneath which the strongbox had been hidden, and it no longer felt like abandoned infrastructure but like a sealed witness. When she finally stepped outside into the snow, the world beyond the icehouse seemed unchanged, but she understood it was only unchanged in appearance, not in reality, because now she carried something that made her invisible life impossible to maintain. The town of Ash Hollow would not allow this discovery to stand unchallenged, and the men who had built their authority on hidden exchange and manipulated record-keeping would not tolerate a woman, especially one already marked as disgraced, holding proof of their structure beneath her coat. By the time she reached the edge of the river path, she had already decided she could not remain silent, but she also understood that speaking alone would not be enough, because truth in Ash Hollow did not survive exposure unless it had force behind it. And so she turned instead toward the one place she had avoided since her father's downfall, the old ledger office ruins, still standing half-collapsed near the rail spur, where the language of numbers had once been pure before it was corrupted by those who had learned to bend it. Inside that broken structure, she began sorting the documents from the strongbox under lantern light, matching names, shipments, signatures, and dates with a precision that returned her to the self she had been before loss hardened her into something quieter and more guarded. As the pattern emerged fully, it became undeniable that Judge Harlan Pierce was not merely complicit but central, his authority used as cover for rerouting rail wealth through falsified agricultural trade, laundering value through ice storage and river transit so that nothing appeared irregular on the surface ledgers. The icehouse had not been chosen randomly, it had been selected because it sat outside official inspection routes, forgotten by modernization, preserved in neglect like a blind spot in law itself. Eliza's hands tightened around the edge of the table as she realized that if this structure had survived here, there were likely others along the river, each one holding fragments of the same hidden economy. The scale of it pressed down on her quietly, not as panic but as responsibility, because what she held now was not just evidence of wrongdoing but a map of how deeply that wrongdoing had been woven into daily life. Outside, the wind carried distant sounds of Ash Hollow waking into its morning routines, unaware that its foundation had just been touched. But Eliza Mercer no longer moved through the world as someone erased, she moved now as someone who had been given access to what others had buried beneath ice and time, and she understood that whatever came next would not be a confrontation of words alone, but of endurance, strategy, and the quiet, unyielding force of truth refusing to stay frozen. That evening, Eliza Mercer returned to the icehouse not as a woman searching for answers, but as someone learning how fragile answers could be when they began to cut against the shape of an entire town's hidden structure. The lantern light was weaker now, the oil running low, and the ice beneath the structure seemed to groan differently. As though aware that what had been buried was no longer safely buried at all. She carried the strongbox with her, not because she trusted its contents in the open air, but because she understood that leaving it hidden would only preserve the silence that had already destroyed her family once before. Each step across the frozen threshold felt heavier than the last, not from the weight of the box itself but from the knowledge that every truth she had uncovered now belonged to forces larger than her own endurance. When she reached the interior again, she placed the strongbox beside the exposed iron chamber and began comparing the markings more carefully, tracing numbers, cross-referencing them with fragments of memory from her father's old ledger methods, until the pattern became undeniable. these were not isolated transactions but nodes in a coordinated system stretching across river trade points and rail intersections. The Icehouse, she realized, was only one node in a chain that used forgotten infrastructure as invisible storage for stolen value, moving wealth under the guise of agricultural exchange while official records remained clean on the surface. And at the center of that network, repeatedly referenced in coded seals and authorization marks, was Judge Harlan Pierce, whose public role as arbiter of law masked his deeper function as protector of the system itself. Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the winter air, because she understood now that exposing this truth would not simply anger individuals, it would destabilize the economic illusion that kept Ash Hollow functioning. Outside, distant lanterns moved along the river road, and she knew that news traveled quickly in towns built on fear of disruption. If she acted too slowly, the system would tighten and erase the evidence. If she acted too quickly, she would be isolated before she could be believed. So she began to work with deliberate patience, copying markings, reconstructing routes, building a map not of geography but of hidden movement, until the Icehouse floor became a kind of inverted ledger itself, revealing what had been written beneath official history. By midnight, she had formed a plan not of confrontation but of exposure, knowing that the strongest structures did not fall from single blows but from carefully revealed contradictions that even their builders could not explain away. And as she closed the lantern and listened to the ice settle around her like an old memory refusing to fade, Eliza Mercer understood that she was no longer merely surviving Ash Hollow, she was beginning to read it in full. The first person to come for her was not Judge Harlan Pierce himself, but a man who moved like authority even when he was dressed in plain wool and dusted boots, a railway inspector named Dalton Hask who arrived in Ash Hollow 2 mornings later with papers that had already been signed before anyone knew there was a dispute. He did not knock on her door at the ruins of the ledger office, he simply appeared at the threshold of the Icehouse as if he had always known where she would be. The wind behind him carried the sound of distant wheels, and with it the quiet suggestion that the town had already begun to close ranks. "You have something that does not belong to you," he said without greeting, his voice measured, not accusatory but final in tone, as though ownership had already been decided elsewhere. Eliza stood between him and the open floor where the iron chamber had been exposed, her lantern placed deliberately at her side so that its light fell across both of them equally. She did not deny it, because denial would have been an invitation to be dismissed, and she had learned by now that silence was sometimes the only form of control left to her. Instead she asked a question she already knew the answer to: who does it belong to? Dalton Hask did not hesitate. "The Rail Commission," he said, though his eyes flickered toward the Strongbox in a way that betrayed the thinness of that claim. Behind him, 2 men waited near the frozen river path, not uniformed, but positioned too carefully to be ordinary travelers. Eliza understood then that the system she had uncovered did not respond to discovery with surprise, it responded with retrieval. She stepped slightly back toward the Icehouse interior, not in retreat but in alignment with the evidence she had already uncovered, and told him quietly that whatever was inside that box had already been documented, copied, and understood. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his expression, not because he doubted her truth, but because he had not been prepared for it to exist outside his control. "You are making a mistake," he said, but the sentence carried less warning than calculation, as though he were adjusting to a new variable. And then, from the river road behind them, came the sound of horses slowing, and Eliza knew before she turned that the town had begun to arrive, not as witnesses, but as pressure. What followed was not a confrontation of violence but of positioning, every figure in the snow adjusting their distance from her as though truth itself created invisible boundaries. When Judge Pierce finally appeared, he did not enter the Icehouse, he remained at its edge, where shadow and frost met, and spoke as though he were addressing not Eliza but the concept of disorder itself. He told her that Ash Hollow could not afford disruption, that what she had found was not hers to interpret, and that certain records existed only to preserve stability, not accuracy. But Eliza no longer heard him as an authority, she heard him as a man trying to preserve a system that required silence to survive. She lifted the strongbox slightly, not as threat but as statement, and said that truth preserved in ice does not stay frozen forever, it eventually becomes water again, and water always finds where it has been blocked. That was when Dalton Hask moved closer, not aggressively, but with the careful intent of taking possession, and for a moment everything held at the edge of motion, river, wind, people, law, until Eliza stepped backward onto the exposed iron chamber beneath the icehouse floor. The weight of her foot shifted something beneath the structure, and a low mechanical click echoed upward, deep and resonant, as though the chamber itself recognized pressure it had been designed to respond to. For the first time, the icehouse did not feel like a hiding place but like a mechanism waiting for authorization. Eliza looked down, realizing that the system was not only storage but activation-based, and that the Strongbox was not merely evidence but a key that completed a sequence. Judge Pierce's expression changed subtly then, because he understood before anyone else what she had triggered. The diamonds, the ledger system, the iron chamber, they were not just concealment. They were part of a verification structure that required a final confirmation point, and she had just placed herself inside it. The wind shifted again, harsher now, and somewhere beneath the ice, something that had remained dormant for years began to respond. The moment the iron chamber beneath the icehouse responded with that deep mechanical click, the air in Ash Hollow seemed to tighten, as though the river itself had drawn a long, silent breath and was now holding it. Eliza Mercer did not move immediately, because she understood instinctively that whatever had activated beneath her feet was not designed to be triggered casually, nor by accident, but by sequence and authorization, the language of systems built by men who believed control could be hidden inside mechanisms. The lantern flickered as distant movement approached outside, and through the frost-laced gaps of the icehouse walls she saw shadows converging, not rushing yet but gathering with intent, as if the town had already been informed without words. Judge Harlan Pierce stood at the edge of that gathering, his presence no longer merely symbolic but operational, like a man stepping into a function he had performed many times before. Dalton Hask remained closer to the structure, watching her now not as a trespasser but as a variable that had become unpredictable. Eliza placed one hand on the exposed iron plate and felt a second vibration respond from below, slower this time, deliberate, like something waking in stages. And then she understood fully, the chamber was not simply storage, nor even a ledger vault, but a transfer point designed to confirm identity through pressure, weight, and presence, meaning her discovery had not only exposed corruption but completed part of its mechanism. The Strongbox at her side suddenly felt less like evidence and more like a component in a larger machine, and when she lifted it slightly, the iron beneath her shifted again, locking into a new state with a sound that echoed outward through the frozen ground. Outside, Judge Pierce finally stepped forward into full view, his voice calm but sharpened by urgency, telling her that she had activated something she did not understand, that certain systems, once opened, could not be closed without consequence. But Eliza no longer saw him as an authority, she saw him as a man attempting to preserve an architecture that depended entirely on her ignorance. She responded not with fear but with clarity, saying that systems built on buried truth always eventually required someone to stand on top of what was hidden, and that she had already spent her life beneath such weight. At that moment, the ice beneath the icehouse floor shifted again, and a concealed panel within the iron chamber slid open with a long, resisting motion, revealing not just compartments but layered compartments, each marked with the same coded ledger system she had traced earlier. Inside were duplicate records, sealed correspondence, and transfer stones embedded in cloth wrappings, confirming that the diamonds were only one tier of a much larger network of extracted wealth moving through river and rail under false classification. The scale of it was no longer abstract, it was physical, present, and structured like a second economy buried beneath the first. Eliza realized then that exposing Judge Pierce alone would not be enough, because the system was not centralized in one man but distributed across roles, with the Icehouse serving as verification hub where transactions were validated through physical confirmation rather than paper alone. The final realization came with cold precision, her presence there, standing on the chamber, had completed a confirmation cycle that made her both witness and trigger in the same system. Outside, tension broke into motion as men began to close in, but before anyone could reach her, Eliza struck the iron plate once with the hammer she had carried since entering the icehouse, not in violence but in deliberate activation, and the chamber responded with a resonant tone that carried across the frozen river like a signal. Somewhere beneath the ice, deeper mechanisms unlocked, not collapsing but revealing, and the hidden Strongbox system opened its final tier. What emerged was not more treasure but consolidated proof, a master ledger binding every transaction across the river network, signed and countersigned in cycles that traced directly to public authority structures in Ash Hollow and beyond. Judge Pierce froze, because for the first time the system he had helped preserve was no longer contained, it had been exposed in its complete architecture. Eliza stepped forward into the lantern light so that all could see her clearly, and she spoke one final truth that did not accuse but simply described, that the river had always carried evidence, but ice had been used to delay its reading. Then she placed the Strongbox down and allowed it to open fully, not as possession but as release, and as the wind surged through the Icehouse, carrying papers outward like thawed fragments of buried history, the town of Ash Hollow stood still long enough for truth to spread beyond containment. In the days that followed, nothing returned to what it had been, because systems that depend on hidden continuity do not survive exposure intact, they fracture into accountability. Judge Pierce's authority dissolved not in spectacle but in accumulated contradiction that could no longer be explained away, and Dalton Hask's silence became testimony rather than compliance. The Rail Commission investigation that followed was not immediate, but it was inevitable, because Eliza's discovery had already rewritten the structure beneath which the town operated. The Icehouse itself, once feared and abandoned, became a point of reckoning, then a place of study, then finally a reminder that even forgotten structures can hold truth longer than those who bury it expect. Eliza did not remain to claim reward or recognition, because what she had recovered was never meant to become personal wealth, it was meant to restore balance to a place that had mistaken concealment for stability. She left Ash Hollow along the river path in early spring when the ice finally loosened its grip, and as she walked, the same water that had once hidden everything now carried light instead of secrecy. And in the quiet distance behind her, the Icehouse stood no longer as ruin but as evidence that even frozen silence eventually remembers how to speak. In time, people would tell the story differently depending on who was speaking, but those who understood ledgers, truth, and the weight of hidden systems would always return to the same conclusion: it was not wealth that changed Ash Hollow, but the moment a woman stood on frozen iron and refused to let silence remain sealed beneath it. And so we return to where we began, to Eliza Mercer, 29 years old when the town tried to erase her, the woman who turned $3 into the key that thawed an entire hidden economy buried beneath ice and law alike, not by force alone, but by refusing to let what was sealed remain unspoken. Until next time, stay close.